"Robert, Vivian," I said, my voice cutting through the warmth of the private dining room like a blade. I looked at the two wealthy, polished executives sitting on either side of my fiancée. "I know exactly what Megan told you. I know she told you her family was toxic or out of the picture, and she needed you to stand in for them tonight. But the older couple standing in that doorway," I pointed toward the back of the room, "they aren't guests. They aren't relatives of mine. They are the two people Megan has spent 2 years pretending no longer existed. Those are her real parents." Megan's face went terrifyingly pale. The color drained from her cheeks so fast it looked like she might pass out. Her hand, resting on Robert's arm, went rigid. The wine glass in front of her tilted, spilling a dark red stain across the pristine white linen tablecloth. She opened her mouth, but her voice caught in her throat. I reached into my jacket pocket, took out the engagement ring, and placed it on the table between us. Not thrown, not dramatic, just placed. "I went to Saginaw, Megan," I said quietly. "I know everything. I know what you are thinking right now. You are thinking that an ordinary man would have thrown the table over, or screamed, or caused a public scene the moment he discovered a lie this massive. But this is not a story about losing control. This is a story about a man who spent 3 weeks building a flawless trap. It is a story about the devastating difference between the people who raise us and the people we invent to impress strangers. You need to hear exactly how this happened, because there are people in this world who will gladly erase the ones who loved them the most, just to buy a ticket to a life they think they deserve. And you need to understand how carefully you have to move when you decide to take that ticket away. To understand why this betrayal cut so deeply, you have to understand the foundation I was raised on. My name is Nicolaus Papadimitriou. Everyone calls me Nico. I am 35, and I run a commercial real estate firm out of Metro Detroit. My father, Stavros, built this company out of nothing in the 1980s. He came to this country with a terrifying work ethic and a deep belief that you take care of your own. I came into the business when I was 26, and we scaled it together. We are Greek-American. My parents still live in Grosse Pointe, in the exact same house they bought the year they got married. In our world, Sunday dinners are mandatory. Every single week, my mother, Eleni, makes spanakopita from scratch. If you sit at her table and you do not eat at least 2 pieces, she takes it as a personal insult. My Uncle Theo lives 12 minutes away and has never waited for an invitation to walk through our front door. We are a loud, involved family. In the Papadimitriou family, marriage is a merger of 2 histories. My father always told me that you can understand a person's true character by watching how they treat the people who gave them their start. I do not fall in love easily. I protect my peace and I protect my family. I have always been incredibly careful about who gets to sit at my mother's table. And then I met Megan. It was late October at a charitable fundraiser in downtown Birmingham. She was wearing a simple, elegant black dress that looked effortless. She introduced herself as an executive in corporate marketing. She was sharp, funny, and relentlessly charming. Within 10 minutes, she had disarmed me. But what actually sealed my fate was how she talked to my family. Uncle Theo had cornered us near the appetizers. He launched into one of his rambling jokes. Megan did not walk away. She laughed, a genuine laugh, and fired a joke right back at him. Theo's eyes lit up. 5 minutes later, she asked my mother a highly specific question about the seasoning in the lamb skewers. My mother talked to her for 45 solid minutes. I stood by the bar watching my fiercely protective mother fall in love with this woman. We dated for 14 months, and I was genuinely happy. She integrated into my life with a speed that felt natural. By the 2nd month, she was a regular at our Sunday dinners. She made me feel like I had finally found the missing piece of a puzzle. I proposed on a Tuesday evening in late spring on the rooftop of the Shinola Hotel in Detroit. When I got down on one knee, she said yes before I even finished the question. When I called my parents, My mother wept through the phone. Everything was moving forward perfectly. I had absolutely no idea that almost everything she had told me about herself was a carefully constructed fabrication. The illusion was so flawlessly executed that I never had a reason to check the foundation. She lived in a gorgeous apartment in Midtown. Her social media was a curated timeline of galas and European vacations. She went by the name Megan Ashford. Every piece of evidence pointed to a woman from a background of privilege, and because I trusted her, I ignored the one glaring absence in her life. I ignored the fact that I had never met a single person who had known her before she moved to Detroit. The first time the topic of her family came up, we were driving back from a holiday party in Ann Arbor. The snow was coming down in heavy sheets. I asked her what she usually did for the holidays. She looked out the window, her expression guarded. She told me her parents were deeply toxic people. Her father was a controlling narcissist, and her mother was a silent enabler. She explained that she had put serious distance between herself and her family, and that they had been estranged for 5 years. She delivered this not with theatrical tears, but with the exhausted tone of someone accepting a difficult truth. She said she even changed her last name on social media to her middle name, Ashford, to get some breathing room. I believed her instantly. I told her she was safe, and she would always have a place at my family's table. I never pushed for more details. In my mind, I was giving the woman I loved the space to heal. I did not realize I was actively helping her pour concrete over her own history. Megan continued to lay the bricks of her fabricated life. She casually dropped names of high-level executives at her wealth management firm, painting a picture of a corporate family that filled the void left by her biological parents. She talked frequently about her senior vice president, Robert Callahan, and his wife, Vivian. She mentioned how Vivian had mentored her and how they frequently invited her to their estate in West Bloomfield. The Callahans felt like a permanent fixture in her life. My family welcomed Megan completely. But as the months passed, the silence surrounding Megan's family began to create pressure. My father, Stavros, is a man who notices empty spaces in a room. He noticed that Megan never received phone calls on holidays. He noticed she never mentioned a funny story about a sibling or a cousin. The tension finally broke the surface on a humid Sunday evening in late July. We were sitting around the dining table in Grosse Pointe. My mother had made pasticcio, and the table was crowded with loud conversation. Megan was sitting to my right, laughing at a story my cousin Nick Jr. was telling, and then Uncle Theo set his fork down, leaned forward, and looked directly at Megan. "Megan, sweetheart," Theo said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I have got to ask you something. Where are your people?" The dining room went silent. It was the kind of heavy silence that happens when someone says the exact thing everyone else has been avoiding. My mother froze with a spoon halfway to a plate. My father crossed his arms, his eyes fixed on Theo. Megan's smile stayed frozen. I saw the tiny tightening of her jaw. "My parents and I are not in contact," she said, her voice smooth. "I believe I have mentioned that." "I know you mentioned it," Theo said, unbothered. "You are marrying my nephew in a few months. You are going to stand in a church and make promises, and we don't know a single person from your side of the aisle." Theo wasn't being cruel. He genuinely could not comprehend a person existing without a family standing behind them. "Theo," my father said, just one word, delivered in a low baritone. A command to drop the subject. Theo picked his fork back up, muttering under his breath about modern people having no respect for roots. My mother desperately pivoted the topic to church renovations. Later that night, I returned to Grosse Pointe to pick up some files. I found Stavros waiting in the kitchen, pouring a glass of red wine. He pushed the glass toward me. "She is a good woman, Nico," my father said. "She is," I replied. "I know Theo upset her tonight. I will talk to him." My father shook his head. "Theo lacks tact, but he does not lack vision. He sees the missing pieces. You are going to marry this woman without knowing a single person whose blood runs in her veins. Her parents are toxic, Pop, I said, feeling defensive. I am not going to force her to drag abusive people into our lives. I believe her. I believe her too, he said quietly. But toxic people still exist somewhere. They still have an address. They still have names. I am simply asking you to know exactly what you are walking into. Because a man who marries a woman without knowing her history is a man walking through a minefield in the dark. He patted my shoulder and walked out, leaving me with a sudden, cold sense of unease. My father's words were the catalyst. I still wasn't suspicious of Megan. I thought I was being a protector. I thought I was going to uncover a history of abuse and stand between her and her past. I had absolutely no idea that the monster I was preparing to protect her from did not even exist. The days following my father's warning were strange. I did not confront Megan. I did not ask her to explain herself or demand to know her parents' names. I simply carried my father's words around with me like a small, heavy stone in my pocket. I watched her. I watched how she interacted with my mother, how she laughed at my uncle's jokes, how seamlessly she had woven herself into the fabric of my life. Everything about her felt so genuine, so deeply rooted in love and respect, that the idea of her hiding some dark, terrifying family history felt almost impossible. But the stone was still in my pocket. The unease my father had planted refused to dissipate. I kept telling myself that I was just being overly protective, that I just needed to know the names of the people who had hurt her so that I could ensure they never came anywhere near our wedding or our future children. I had convinced myself that I was on a rescue mission. The opportunity to find out the truth did not come from a dramatic confrontation or a slipped secret. It came from a completely routine piece of administrative boredom. By the 11th month of our engagement, Megan had officially moved out of her apartment and into a stunning high-rise condominium in downtown Detroit, a property that happened to be owned and managed by my firm. Because we were getting married in just a few weeks, and her name needed to be formally attached to the master corporate lease for tax and liability purposes, our legal department sent her a standard packet of paperwork. It was a completely standard procedure, the kind of thing our office processes a dozen times a week. It was a Friday afternoon. The office was quiet, mostly empty as people had already started filtering out for the weekend. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing some zoning permits, when my office manager walked in and dropped a manila folder on my desk. It was the processed paperwork for the condo lease. I opened the folder, mostly out of habit, just to make sure all the signature lines had been checked off. The top page was a high-resolution photocopy of the state-issued driver's license she had uploaded to our secure portal. I looked down at the plastic rectangle. The photo was definitely her, smiling that perfectly curated, professional smile. But the name printed next to the photo was not Megan Ashford. It read, Megan Melissa Bennett Bennett, not Ashford. I stared at the name for a long, quiet moment. I remember the air conditioning kicking on in my office, the low hum of it suddenly sounding incredibly loud. She had told me she changed her name on social media to hide from her toxic parents. But she had always introduced herself to my friends and colleagues as Megan Ashford. I had assumed Ashford was her legal last name, but here it was, staring up at me in stark black and white on a government document. Bennett. I closed my office door. I sat back down at my computer, opened a new tab and typed the name into our firm's public records database. It is a powerful tool, usually reserved for running deep background checks on potential commercial tenants. I typed in Megan Melissa Bennett. A few clicks later, I found a dormant Facebook profile, untouched since her college years. The profile picture was a slightly blurry shot of her in a graduation gown, standing on the campus of the University of Michigan. I kept digging. It took me less than 10 minutes to cross-reference the name and find a primary residential address attached to her early financial records. The address was on a street called Maple Avenue in Saginaw, Michigan. Saginaw is a working-class city about an hour and 40 minutes north of Detroit, straight up Interstate 75. It is not a place known for corporate galas or high-society networking. It is a place known for auto manufacturing, harsh winters, and hard-working people. I sat in my quiet office and looked at the address on my screen. This was it. This was the dark, toxic origin story she had been running from. This was where the monsters lived. I picked up my phone and texted Megan. I told her that an urgent issue had come up with a property we were looking to acquire up north, and that I had to do a sudden, mandatory walkthrough. I told her I would be gone for most of the Saturday. She texted back immediately, a red heart emoji followed by, "Be safe, babe. See you for dinner tonight. I love you." The drive up Interstate 75 the next morning was one of the longest drives of my life. The sky was a pale, flat gray, the kind of overcast morning that makes everything look slightly washed out. I kept the radio off the entire time. I spent the entire hour and 40 minutes rehearsing introductions in my head, trying to mentally prepare myself to stand face to face with the people who had terrorized the woman I loved. I was genuinely anxious. I kept wondering if they would be wealthy, imposing, judgmental people who would look at me and decide I was not good enough. I wondered if her father was a cruel corporate executive who had demanded perfection from her. I wondered if they would yell, or slam the door in my face, or threaten me. I had built them up into absolute titans of cruelty in my mind. I got off the highway and followed the GPS through the streets of Saginaw. The deeper I drove into the city, the more confused I became. The GPS led me away from the affluent neighborhoods and into a quiet, modest subdivision of single-story ranch homes. The streets were clean, lined with mature oak trees and American flags hanging from porch columns. It was the kind of neighborhood where people know their mail carriers by name and wave to each other from their driveways. I slowed my truck to a crawl as I approached the address on Maple Avenue. I pulled over to the curb and put the truck in park. I sat there for a full 5 minutes, staring at the house, completely recalibrating everything I thought I knew. There was no iron gate. There was no luxury sports car in the driveway. The house was a small, meticulously kept ranch with light blue siding. There were wind chimes hanging from the front porch awning. A small, carefully tended flower bed lined the front walkway. And standing in the front yard, holding a bright green garden hose, was an older man. He was wearing a faded Detroit Tigers t-shirt, a pair of worn denim jeans, and reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead. He was moving slowly, watering the marigolds with the unhurried, peaceful patience of a man who had absolutely nowhere more important to be. These were not intimidating people. These were not corporate titans or wealthy snobs. These were regular, working-class people. For one brief, uncomplicated moment, sitting in the cab of my truck, I felt a massive wave of relief. I thought to myself, this is a misunderstanding. Whatever happened between Megan and this man watering his flowers, it can be fixed. They are just normal people. I turned off the engine, stepped out of the truck, and started walking up the driveway. The man noticed me when I was about 10 feet away. He stopped watering and squinted at me in that cautious, polite way people do when a stranger approaches their property. "Can I help you with something?" he asked. His voice was raspy, warm. I stopped. I took a deep breath. "Sir, you do not know me," I said. "My name is Nico Papadimitriou. I am engaged to your daughter, Megan." Gerald Bennett did not fumble the garden hose. He dropped it. The heavy brass nozzle hit the concrete driveway with a loud clatter. Water began pooling around our shoes, flowing in a small, steady river down toward the street. Gerald just stood there, staring at me. His hands began to shake, and then his face did something I was unprepared for. It did not harden with anger. It did not contort with the toxic rage Megan had described. It crumbled. It crumbled with an overwhelming, desperate relief. It was the look of a man who had been carrying a crushing weight for years and had finally found a place to set it down. "Nancy," his voice broke on his wife's name. It was a raw, choked sound. "Nancy, come outside." In that single devastating moment, standing on a wet driveway in Saginaw, watching a retired postal worker try and fail to hold back his tears, the entire architecture of the lie began to collapse. Inside the Bennett house, everything I thought I knew about the woman I was going to marry was systematically dismantled. It happened quietly, methodically, over a pot of black coffee I had not asked for and a plate of homemade cookies that Nancy Bennett had set on the kitchen table with violently shaking hands. The house was spotlessly clean, smelling faintly of lemon polish and old wood. But what struck me immediately, what made my stomach drop the moment I walked through the front door, was that the house was completely, obsessively filled with Megan. There were school photos pinned to the refrigerator. There were framed birthday pictures lining the hallway. There was a beautiful prom photo sitting in the center of the living room mantel. And on the wall right next to the kitchen table hung a large, professionally framed portrait from her college graduation. In the photo, Gerald and Nancy stood on either side of Megan, beaming with pride. Gerald had his arm wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Nancy's face looked so fiercely proud that it actually hurt me to look at it. These were not the faces of abusers. These were not the faces of toxic, controlling narcissists. These were the faces of parents who deeply, desperately missed their child. The story came out carefully, piece by piece, as we sat around the small wooden table. Gerald was a retired postal worker. He had walked a delivery route for 31 years. Nancy had worked as a secretary in the local Saginaw public school district for most of Megan's childhood. They were not wealthy, but they had sacrificed everything to give their daughter a head start in life. They had paid for her entire education at the University of Michigan. She had graduated with a full degree and zero parental debt. They were incredibly proud of that fact. Gerald mentioned it twice, his voice thick with a quiet, hard-earned dignity. When Megan moved to Detroit and started climbing the corporate ladder in marketing, things began to change, slowly at first. The Sunday phone calls got shorter. The weekend visits home stopped entirely. She started appearing in photos online under her middle name, Ashford, wearing clothes they could not afford and attending events with people they did not recognize. She was building a new version of herself, and they were not included in the blueprints. But the final break, the moment she erased them completely, had happened 2 years ago. It was the wedding conversation. Megan had come home for a brief, tense dinner and announced that she was getting married to her previous boyfriend, a wealthy corporate lawyer. She sat at this exact kitchen table and told Gerald and Nancy that she expected a wedding that reflected her new social status. She asked them for $100,000. That engagement eventually collapsed, Gerald told me. But the damage had already been done. Megan never came back. She simply carried the lie into the next version of her life, into me. Gerald looked down at his coffee mug as he told me this part. He traced the rim of the cup with his thumb. "I told her we didn't have it, Nico," he said quietly. "I told her we had $15,000 in savings that we could give her. It was everything we had without mortgaging the house and destroying our retirement. I begged her to take it. I told her it was all we could do." "And what did she say?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Nancy closed her eyes. A single tear escaped and tracked down her cheek. She said, "If you cannot invest in my future, then you are not going to be a part of it." She stood up from the table, drove back to Detroit, and blocked their numbers that same night. They had not heard her voice in 2 years. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. I felt physically sick. I felt a cold, dark anger beginning to pool in my chest, an anger so profound it felt like it was altering my DNA. She had not just lied to me. She had murdered these people in her mind, purely because their modest, working-class lives did not fit the wealthy, high society aesthetic she was trying to project to her corporate friends. She had traded the people who gave her everything for a fake last name and a seat at a richer table. Nancy reached into a drawer next to the table and pulled out a small stack of envelopes. She slid the top one across the table toward me. It was a birthday card. It was sealed, unopened, and had a bright red return to sender stamp plastered aggressively across the front. I looked at the return address label in the top left corner. It was my address. Megan's handwriting was unmistakable. I stared at the red stamp. I felt the overwhelming weight of Nancy's grief pressing down on me. I slowly reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the text message thread with Megan. I scrolled to the message she had sent me late the previous evening, the message I had read right before falling asleep, the message that had prompted me to make this drive in the first place. That was the moment I realized Megan was not just insecure. She was willing to rewrite reality itself if it protected the image she wanted people to see. I sat at the kitchen table with Gerald and Nancy Bennett, looking at my phone. The message Megan had sent me the night before read, "Babe, I have great news. I finally reached out to my parents. We had a long emotional talk. They finally apologized for everything they put me through. And they want to make things right. They are driving into the city and want to meet you for lunch tomorrow at the Lark in West Bloomfield. I am so excited for you to finally meet them. This means everything to me." The kitchen was silent. I looked up slowly. Gerald and Nancy Bennett were sitting directly across from me, drinking Folger's coffee in Saginaw, entirely oblivious to the digital reality their daughter was constructing in real time. They had not apologized. They had not spoken to her. They were certainly not driving to an expensive restaurant in West Bloomfield for lunch tomorrow. I turned my phone around and slid it across the table. I let the bright screen illuminate the space between us. Nancy leaned forward and read the text message. She did not gasp. She did not cry. She just set the phone down gently on the table and stared at the wood grain. Gerald looked out the kitchen window, staring blankly at the flower bed he had been watering when I walked up. He looked incredibly, impossibly old. In that moment, I thought about my drive up Interstate 75. I thought about my rehearsed introductions, my quiet fear that I would not be good enough for these wealthy, intimidating people. I almost laughed. A bitter, dark sound caught in my throat. I had spent weeks worrying that Megan's parents might look down on me, that I was too loud, too Greek, too unpolished for their high society standards. And they were here, in a ranch house on Maple Avenue, with wind chimes and a garden hose and 2 years of unopened birthday cards sitting in a kitchen drawer. The person who had decided someone was not good enough was not them. It was her. It had always been her. I took my phone back and slipped it into my pocket. I stood up from the table. I did not know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew that the man who had driven up from Detroit, the man who was nervous about making a good impression, was dead. The man standing in that kitchen was entirely different. I looked down at Gerald and Nancy Bennett. I looked at the tears shining in Nancy's eyes and the quiet devastation in Gerald's posture. "Gerald," I said, my voice harder and colder than it had ever been in my life. "Nancy, I need you to listen to me. I am going to drive back to Detroit. I am going to go to this lunch tomorrow. I am going to sit across from whoever she brings to play the role of her parents, and I am going to smile, and I am going to shake their hands." Nancy looked up at me, confused. "But Nico, why?" "Because," I said, leaning my hands flat on the table, "a half-told lie is just an argument. A fully told lie is a confession. I am going to let her finish the lie. And then, I am going to invite those actors to our engagement dinner." I paused, looking between the two of them. "And when that dinner happens, I am going to need the two of you to be there." Gerald looked up at me. The devastation in his eyes shifted very slightly into something that looked a lot like resolve. He nodded once, a slow, heavy movement. "We will be there," he said. I walked out of the house, got back into my truck, and pointed it south toward Detroit. The trap was officially open. I just needed to let her walk into it. If you are watching this, and you have ever dealt with someone who could lie this easily, drop a comment below. Tell me how they construct their reality. Hit the like button if you know exactly how dangerous that kind of person can be. The difference between a good liar and a truly great one is that a great liar never breaks character. Not even when the audience is not looking. Not even in the quiet moments when the curtain is supposed to be drawn. When I unlocked the door to our midtown apartment late that Saturday afternoon, my heart was hammering against my ribs with a slow, heavy rhythm. I had just driven an hour and 40 minutes back from Saginaw. The image of Nancy Bennett crying over an unopened birthday card was burned so deeply into my retinas that I felt like I could not see anything else. I stood in the small entryway of our apartment, taking off my coat, physically bracing myself for the performance I was about to give. I walked into the living room. Megan was sitting on our plush velvet sofa. She was wearing comfortable cashmere sweatpants, holding a half-empty glass of white wine, with her laptop open on her knees. The television was playing a cooking show on low volume. She looked completely relaxed, completely unbothered, the picture of a woman whose life was proceeding exactly according to plan. She looked up when I walked in and gave me that bright, effortless smile. The same smile that had completely disarmed me at a fundraiser 14 months ago. "How was the property walkthrough?" she asked, taking a sip of her wine. "It was fine," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. A little too flat, but she did not seem to notice. "The foundation is solid. It just needs some structural work on the inside." "Long drive," she said sympathetically, patting the empty cushion next to her. "You look exhausted, babe. Come sit. I am looking at floral arrangements for the reception. I think I want to go with white orchids. What do you think?" I walked over and sat down next to the woman who had entirely fabricated her existence. I looked at the screen. I looked at the white flowers. I felt a surge of adrenaline so violent that my vision actually blurred for a second. Every instinct I possessed, every protective, aggressive impulse I had inherited from my Greek ancestors, was screaming at me to stand up, grab her laptop, throw it against the wall, and demand to know why she had told me her parents had apologized when I had just watched her father cry in his driveway. I wanted to shake her. I wanted to break the perfect, polished glass of her illusion into 1,000 pieces right then and there. But I did not. I remembered my father standing in his kitchen, tracing the edge of his wine glass. A half-told lie is just an argument. A fully told lie is a confession. If I confronted her now in the privacy of our living room, it would just be a fight. She would find an angle. She would cry. She would twist the narrative. She would tell me that Gerald and Nancy were abusive manipulators who had somehow tricked me into feeling sorry for them. She would gaslight me until I was the one apologizing for violating her trust by driving to Saginaw in the first place. Narcissists do not break when you confront them in private, they just pivot. To destroy a narcissist, you cannot just expose their lie. You have to let them build the stage, light the candles, and invite the audience. And then you burn the theater down. I leaned back against the sofa, looked at the white orchids on her screen, and forced my muscles to relax. "White orchids are perfect," I said quietly. "Let's go with those." For the next 4 days, I lived in a state of hypervigilance. I did not snoop through her phone. I did not follow her. I simply listened to the way she spoke with a newly calibrated set of ears. Once you realize that a person is actively constructing a false reality, the seams in their stories become glaringly obvious. I noticed how she casually dropped the names Robert and Vivian Callahan into almost every conversation. She was warming me up. She was establishing their presence, ensuring that when I finally sat across from them at a table, I would already view them as towering, unquestionable figures of authority in her life. Thursday morning, the calendar notification popped up on my phone. Lunch, Robert and Vivian, The Lark, West Bloomfield, Saturday at 12:30 in the afternoon. She had added a small digital note to the invite. It read, "I cannot wait for you to finally meet them." This means everything to me. I sat at my desk and stared at the notification. The Lark is an institution in Metro Detroit. It is old money, heavy oak tables, dim lighting, and the kind of quiet, insulated atmosphere where people go to feel important. It was exactly the kind of place Megan would choose to legitimize her fake parents. I spent Thursday night turning over a very specific question in my mind. Robert Callahan was a senior vice president at a major wealth management firm. Vivian Callahan sat on the boards of different Detroit charities. These were not stupid people. They did not get to their positions by being easily manipulated. For Megan to convince them to sit at a table and actively pretend to be her parents, she had to have given them a story that justified the deception. What did she tell them? I realized she must have weaponized my own family against me. She must have told the Callahans that my traditional, fiercely tight-knit Greek family was deeply judgmental. She probably told them that she was an orphan, or that her real parents were violently abusive and out of the picture. She likely painted herself as a vulnerable, hard-working young woman terrified of being rejected by her fiancé's traditional parents because she did not have a family of her own. She asked the Callahans, her mentors, to step in and act as honorary parental figures so she would not have to face us alone. She used their kindness, their ego, and their protective instinct to cast them in her play. Saturday arrived. I parked my truck in the lot outside the lock, straightened my tie in the rearview mirror, and walked inside. They were already seated at a corner table. Megan was in the middle. Robert Callahan sat to her left, looking effortlessly wealthy in a tailored gray suit and a silver watch that probably cost a year of Gerald Bennett's postal pension. Vivian sat to her right, draped in understated cashmere, a string of perfect pearls resting at her collarbone. Megan was glowing. She looked incredibly, dangerously happy. When I reached the table, I put on the best performance of my entire life. I smiled a massive, warm, genuine smile. I extended my hand. Megan beamed. "Nico," she said, her voice dropping into a register of pure theatrical affection. "I am so incredibly happy to introduce you. This is my dad, Robert, and my mom, Vivian." She did not say mentors. She did not say parental figures. She looked me dead in the eye and called them Mom and Dad. I shook Robert's hand. He had a firm, authoritative grip. "It is an absolute honor to finally meet you both," I said. "Megan talks about you constantly." We sat down. The waiter poured sparkling water, and for the next 45 minutes, I sat there and ate pan-seared scallops while watching three people engage in a masterclass of collective delusion. Megan was the conductor. She guided the conversation with flawless precision, laughing at Robert's jokes a fraction of a second too quickly, placing her hand over Vivian's to emphasize a point. They traded fake memories. They referenced summer trips to a lake house in Charlevoix. Vivian asked me polite, probing questions about my real estate firm, acting exactly the way a concerned, protective mother is supposed to act when evaluating her future son-in-law. Robert poured the wine and offered me unsolicited advice about the Detroit commercial market. I played my part perfectly. I laughed. I deferred to Robert's wisdom. I complimented Vivian's jewelry. I was the absolute picture of a young man desperate to impress his wealthy future in-laws. As the plates were being cleared, I wiped my mouth with my linen napkin, set it down on the table, and leaned forward. I clasped my hands together, shifting my posture to signal that I was about to say something important. "Robert, Vivian," I said, looking between them, "I have to be honest with you. My family, especially on my father's side, is incredibly traditional. We are Greek. We do not do things quietly. And my parents would absolutely never forgive me if we walked down the aisle without doing this properly." Robert tilted his head, his silver hair catching the low light of the restaurant. "Doing what properly, Nico?" he asked, his tone paternal and indulgent. "An engagement dinner," I said. "Just the families. We want to host a private dinner next Saturday night. Good food, a few toasts. It is a matter of profound respect in our culture. My parents need to formally welcome the people who raised Megan. They need to break bread with you before the wedding." I looked at Megan, Her eyes were wide, shining with an absolute, unadulterated triumph. She thought she had pulled off the ultimate heist. She thought she had successfully tricked the traditional Greek family into accepting a pair of wealthy executives as her bloodline. Robert glanced at Vivian. It was a half-second of silent, marital communication. Vivian gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Robert smiled and raised his wineglass. "Nico," he said smoothly, "we would be absolutely honored." "Perfect," I said. I raised my glass and clinked it against his. "It is settled then." I left the lunch early, citing a sudden crisis at a commercial property in Southfield. I walked out to my truck, got in, closed the door, and let out a breath that I felt like I had been holding for an hour and a half. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming toxicity of what I had just witnessed. I started the engine and drove straight to Grosse Pointe. My parents' house was quiet when I walked in. I found my father in his study, going over architectural blueprints for a new development. Uncle Theo was sitting in a leather armchair in the corner, loudly eating a bowl of pistachios and dropping the shells into a crystal ashtray. I closed the heavy oak doors of the study behind me. I stood in the center of the room. "I found them," I said. My father stopped tracing a line on his blueprint. He slowly set his pen down and looked up at me. Theo stopped chewing. For the next 20 minutes, I laid everything out. I did not raise my voice. I gave them the facts chronologically and precisely, the same way we review a failing corporate asset. I told them about the name on the lease, the drive to Saginaw, the ranch house with the wind chimes, Gerald and Nancy Bennett, the $100,000 demand, the returned birthday card. And finally, I told them about the lunch I had just left and the two wealthy executives who had just accepted an invitation to attend an engagement dinner posing as Megan's parents. When I finished, the silence in the study was absolute. Uncle Theo reacted exactly how I knew he would. His face turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple. He stood up so fast he knocked the crystal ashtray off the side table. Pistachio shells scattered across the Persian rug. Theo unleashed a string of Greek curses so colorful that even my father looked impressed. He wanted to drive to Midtown right that second and throw her out onto Woodward Avenue. "Sit down, Theo," my father barked. The command was so sharp it cracked like a whip. Theo stopped pacing. He glared at my father, his chest heaving, but he slowly lowered himself back into the leather chair. My father leaned back in his desk chair. He steepled his fingers together and looked at me. His eyes were entirely black, devoid of any warmth. He was no longer a father looking at his son. He was a patriarch calculating the exact trajectory of a strike. "What do you want to do, Nico?" he asked quietly. "I want to hold the dinner," I said. "I want to host it in the private room at Pegasus Taverna. I want Robert and Vivian Callahan sitting at the head of the table. I want Megan to feel completely, totally safe. And then I want the side door to open. And I want Gerald and Nancy Bennett to walk into the room." My father stared at me for a long time. He evaluated the geometry of the trap. He weighed the potential for public humiliation against the absolute necessity of a clean, undeniable execution. He reached across his desk and picked up his phone. He dialed a number from memory and held the receiver to his ear. "Tony," my father said, his voice dropping into a smooth, familiar warmth. "It is Stavros, yes, the family as well. Listen to me. I need the private room in the back for next Saturday night. 7 o'clock. Nobody goes in or out of that room unless they clear it with my son. Pull your best waiters. Eleni will handle the menu." He hung up the phone and looked at me. "It is done." The following Saturday arrived with the slow, agonizing crawl of a pending execution. Pegasus Taverna is a legendary establishment in downtown Detroit. But the private dining room in the back operates on an entirely different frequency. It is insulated from the noise, with dim lighting and pristine white linen tablecloths. My family arrived a full hour before the guests. My mother, Eleni, adjusted the floral centerpieces with the focused energy of a general. Her initial sorrow had hardened into a cold determination. She was going to host this dinner flawlessly. Nick Jr. was stationed near the hallway, ready to escort Gerald and Nancy Bennett to the manager's office until I gave the signal. Uncle Theo sat at a side table, eating a plate of tiropita, vibrating with suppressed rage. My father stood near the bar, nursing a glass of bourbon. He gave me one slow nod. We were ready. At exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy wooden doors of the private room swung open. I heard Megan's laugh before I saw her. It was a bright, glittering sound, designed to announce her arrival to the room. She walked in wearing a stunning navy blue dress, her hair perfectly styled. She looked magnificent. She looked like a woman who owned the world. Robert Callahan walked in beside her, wearing an expensive charcoal suit, moving with the easy, sweeping confidence of a man who assumes he is the most important person in any room he enters. Vivian followed, elegant and poised, offering a gracious smile to my mother. Megan immediately went to work. She crossed the room and kissed my mother on both cheeks. She shook my father's hand with both of hers, thanking him profusely for hosting such a beautiful evening. She linked her arm through Robert's and proudly introduced him to Uncle Theo, who managed to shake the man's hand without openly snarling. They took their seats. I sat at the head of the table. Megan sat to my right, with Robert and Vivian next to her. My parents sat to my left. The waiters began bringing out the food: massive platters of grilled branzino, steaming bowls of lemon rice, baskets of warm pita bread, and plates of thick, marinated lamb chops. The wine flowed. The conversation swelled to fill the room. Robert leaned across the table, engaging my father in a discussion about commercial property taxes. My father, displaying a level of self-control that frankly terrified me, engaged him right back, nodding thoughtfully and offering sharp, insightful comments. Vivian complimented my mother on the food. Megan sat there, glowing in the warm light of the restaurant, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand. She was so happy. She was completely, entirely immersed in the illusion she had built. She thought she had successfully merged her fake, high-society parents with my traditional, wealthy family. She thought the concrete had finally set on her new identity. I ate my food. I smiled. I laughed at Robert's jokes. I checked my watch. It was 7:45. I reached into my jacket pocket. My fingers brushed against the small velvet box containing the engagement ring I had bought 6 months ago. I pulled out my phone and held it under the table. I opened my messages. I found the text thread with Nick Jr., who was standing in the manager's office just 30 feet away. I typed one single word: now. I put my phone away. I picked up my knife. I looked across the table at the woman I had almost married, and then I tapped the metal blade against the side of my water glass. Just once, a clean, sharp sound that cut through the room like a guillotine. The sound of the knife hitting the glass was not particularly loud, but in the insulated acoustics of the private dining room, it commanded absolute, immediate authority. The sprawling, multi-layered conversations happening around the long table evaporated instantly. Robert Callahan stopped mid-sentence. My father slowly lowered his wine glass. My mother, who had been listening to Vivian describe a recent charity gala, folded her hands in her lap and looked down at the white tablecloth. Every eye in the room turned toward me. Megan was sitting directly to my right. She looked up at me with a radiant, perfectly constructed smile. Her hand was resting casually on Robert's forearm, a physical anchor to the man she was presenting as her father. She shifted her shoulders slightly, adjusting her posture to look attentive and adoring. She fully believed that the next 60 seconds of her life were going to be a toast. She thought I was about to stand up, raise my glass, and tell a room full of wealthy, influential people how incredibly lucky I was to marry the daughter of Robert and Vivian Callahan. I did not raise my glass. I did not stand up. I simply sat at the head of the table and let the silence stretch. I let it stretch for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. Silence is a physical weight. When you let it hang in a room without trying to fill it, people become incredibly uncomfortable. Robert cleared his throat. Vivian adjusted her pearl necklace. Megan's smile faltered, just a fraction of an inch at the corners of her mouth. Her eyes darted quickly across my face, looking for the cue, looking for the warmth she expected to find there. I kept my expression entirely neutral. I looked at Robert, then at Vivian, and finally down at Megan. My family takes tradition very seriously, I said. My voice was calm, measured, dropping into the exact same low, authoritative register my father uses during tense corporate negotiations. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice a single decibel above a standard conversational tone. I looked around the table. I explained that the people you bring to your table tell the world exactly who you are. I said that in our family, we do not make promises in front of God, and we certainly do not merge our bloodlines without knowing exactly who is standing on the other side of the altar. Megan's hand slipped off Robert's arm. She placed it in her lap. Her breathing had become slightly shallow. "Nico," she whispered, her voice tight. "What are you doing?" I ignored her. I looked toward the back of the room, past the table, past the waiters who were standing frozen near the walls. I looked at Tony, the restaurant manager, who was standing with his hand on the brass handle of the heavy wooden side door. I said, "So I want to make sure tonight that we have the right people sitting at this table." I nodded at Tony. Tony pulled the brass handle. The heavy wood swung inward, pulling the warm, garlic-scented air of the restaurant with it. Nick Jr. stepped into the doorway, and then he stepped aside. Gerald and Nancy Bennett walked into the private dining room. The silence in the room before had been uncomfortable. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying, and profound. It was the sound of the oxygen being sucked out of the room. Gerald was wearing the navy blazer. It was an older cut, slightly worn at the elbows, but impeccably pressed. He was holding a gray newsboy cap in his thick working-man hands. Nancy was wearing a modest burgundy dress. She had a small black purse clutched tightly in front of her. They did not look like wealthy executives. They did not look like people who belonged in a private dining room at Pegasus Taverna. But they walked in with their chins held high, possessing the quiet, unbreakable dignity of people who have nothing left to hide. They stopped at the edge of the table. I watched Megan. I watched the physical manifestation of sheer, unadulterated panic completely overtake a human body. The color did not just leave her face. It vanished. Her skin turned an ashen, sickly shade of gray. Her body went entirely rigid, as if she had been struck by lightning. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes, wide and completely terrified, locked onto the older couple standing at the end of the table. The wine glass in front of her began to tilt as her trembling fingers knocked against the base. I reached over, caught the stem of the glass, and set it firmly back down on the tablecloth. I looked at Robert and Vivian. They were staring at Gerald and Nancy with polite, aristocratic confusion. They had absolutely no idea what was happening. They assumed these were perhaps distant relatives of mine, or restaurant staff, or someone who had walked into the wrong room. "Robert, Vivian," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. I looked at the two wealthy, polished executives sitting on either side of my fiancée. "I know exactly what Megan told you. I know she told you her family was toxic or out of the picture. I know she told you she needed you to stand in for them tonight because she had no one else." Vivian stared at Megan, her eyes wide with shock. "Megan," Vivian whispered, her voice shaking. "You told us your parents were dead." Robert frowned, his thick silver eyebrows drawing together. "Nico, I don't understand," he started to say. I raised a hand to stop him. I pointed down the length of the table toward the older couple. "But the man and woman standing in that doorway right now?" I asked. "The retired postal worker and the school secretary who just drove an hour and 40 minutes down Interstate 75 from Saginaw to be here tonight?" I looked Megan dead in the eye. "Those are her real parents." Vivian Callahan physically recoiled in her chair. She pulled her hands back from the table as if the tablecloth had suddenly caught fire. She turned her head and stared at Megan, her eyes wide with shock and a rapidly dawning horror. Robert sat perfectly still, his jaw tightening as the reality of the situation locked into place. These were smart people. It did not take them long to do the math. They realized in real time that they had not been acting as noble mentors protecting a vulnerable young woman. They had been used as highly curated props in a sociopathic stage play. Megan tried to speak. She opened her mouth and a sound came out, a pathetic, high-pitched gasp. "Nico," she choked out. "Nico, please, you don't understand. They are abusive. They hurt me." She was trying to run the play. She was trying to pivot, to trigger my protective instincts, to cast them as the villains one last time. Gerald Bennett took a single step forward. He did not yell. He did not wave his hands. He simply looked at the daughter he had not spoken to in 2 years. "We paid for your college, Megan," Gerald said. His raspy, warm voice echoed off the heavy oak walls. It was devastating in its simplicity. "We gave you everything we had. We just didn't have the $100,000 you demanded for a wedding." He didn't need to say anything else. He didn't need to yell. The sheer, heartbreaking truth of his statement hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Megan looked frantically around the table. She looked at Vivian, seeking a lifeline. Vivian deliberately turned her head away, staring blankly at the wall. She looked at Robert. Robert was looking at her with a cold, disgusted expression, the kind of look a man gives a con artist who has just tried to pick his pocket. She looked at my mother, who was sitting perfectly straight, her face a mask of stone. She looked at Uncle Theo, who was grinning a dark, terrifying, triumphant grin around a mouthful of phyllo dough. She had nowhere left to run. The walls of her fabricated reality had completely collapsed, leaving her sitting in the wreckage. I reached into my jacket pocket. I pulled out the small, black velvet box. I opened it, took out the 2-carat diamond engagement ring, and placed it on the table directly in front of her. I did not throw it. I did not slam it down. I placed it gently next to her water glass. "A half-told lie is just an argument, Megan," I said quietly. "A fully told lie is a confession. I went to Saginaw. I sat in their kitchen. I know everything." I stood up from the table. I looked at Robert and Vivian Callahan. "Robert, Vivian, I am incredibly sorry that you were dragged into this. You were manipulated just as severely as I was. You are free to leave." Robert Callahan stood up immediately. He looked down at Megan, his expression perfectly cold. "You used my wife's sympathy as a costume," he said. He didn't wait for a response. He simply pulled Vivian's chair back, offered her his hand, and escorted his wife out of the room. They walked past Gerald and Nancy, Robert offering a short, stiff nod of profound apology to the older man, before disappearing through the side doors. My father stood up next. He buttoned his suit jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and looked around the table. "Eleni, Theo, Nick," he said calmly. "We are leaving." My family rose in unison. They did not yell at Megan. They did not throw water in her face or hurl insults. They gave her the worst punishment a Greek family can possibly inflict upon a person. They gave her their absolute, total indifference. They treated her like she no longer existed. My mother walked past Megan without a single glance. Uncle Theo wiped his mouth with a napkin, tossed it onto his half-eaten plate, and followed my father out the door. I was the last one standing at the table. Megan was sitting in her chair, staring blankly at the diamond ring resting on the white linen. She was completely alone. The wealthy mentors had abandoned her. The wealthy fiancé had exposed her. The carefully constructed socialite identity had been burned to the ground in less than 5 minutes. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel a rush of vindictive joy. I just felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. I turned my back on her and walked toward the side door, where Gerald and Nancy Bennett were still standing. I placed my hand gently on Gerald's shoulder and guided him and his wife out of the private room, leaving Megan sitting alone in the silence. The fallout was swift and absolute. Within 24 hours, I cancelled the venue, the caterers, and every single vendor associated with the wedding. Robert and Vivian cut all ties with Megan. Word travels fast in the corporate circles of Metro Detroit, and the rumors about why the golden couple had spectacularly self-destructed began to circulate immediately. Megan sent me dozens of frantic text messages begging for a chance to explain, to go to therapy, to make it right. I did not answer a single one. I hired a mediator to oversee the packing of her belongings from the condo. I never saw her again, but the real conclusion of this story did not happen in the aftermath. It happened that night, outside the restaurant. The cool night air of downtown Detroit felt incredible as we stepped out onto the sidewalk outside Pegasus Taverna. The street was alive with noise, with people walking between bars and casinos, completely oblivious to the emotional detonation that had just occurred inside. My family was waiting for us near the valet stand. When we walked up, the dynamic shifted entirely. The cold, tactical precision my family had displayed inside the room vanished, replaced instantly by the overwhelming, aggressive warmth that defines who we are. My mother, Eleni, stepped forward. She did not introduce herself. She did not offer a polite handshake. She walked directly up to Nancy Bennett, a woman she had never met before tonight, wrapped her arms around her, and pulled her into a fierce, bone-crushing embrace. Nancy, who had held her composure perfectly inside the restaurant, finally broke. She buried her face in my mother's shoulder and began to sob quietly. My mother stroked her hair, murmuring soft, comforting words in Greek, holding the woman whose daughter had tried to erase her from the world. My father, Stavros, walked up to Gerald. He extended his hand. Gerald took it. My father did not just shake his hand. He gripped it firmly and pulled Gerald into a brief, strong half-hug, clapping him heavily on the back. "You raised a daughter and put her through school," my father said, his voice thick with respect. "You did your job as a father. What she decided to become after she left your house is not your fault. It is her tragedy, not yours." Gerald nodded, wiping a tear from his eye with the back of his rough hand. "Thank you, Stavros," he said quietly. I stood back and watched the scene unfold. I watched the two families, the loud, wealthy Greek family from Grosse Pointe and the quiet, working-class family from Saginaw, standing together on the sidewalk in downtown Detroit. We had absolutely nothing in common financially or socially, but in that moment, none of that mattered. We were bound together by a shared understanding of what actually matters in this world. I realized then that my father had been entirely right. The money, the status, the high-rise condos, and the expensive dinners, none of it means anything if the foundation is rotten. Megan had spent her entire adult life trying to buy her way into a family she thought was better than her own. But in doing so, she had fundamentally misunderstood what made our family strong in the first place. We do not value people because of their bank accounts or their corporate titles. We value them because of their history, their loyalty, and their truth. By trying to erase her past, Megan had destroyed her future, and by exposing her lie, I had not just saved myself from a disastrous marriage. I had returned a stolen dignity to a retired postal worker and a school secretary who had done absolutely nothing wrong. I walked over to Nancy, who was wiping her eyes with a tissue my mother had given her. I reached into the bed of my truck, where I had placed the massive, expensive floral arrangement I had originally bought to give to Megan's fake mother, Vivian. I pulled the flowers out and handed them to Nancy. "These are for you, Mrs. Bennett," I said. "Thank you for coming tonight." Nancy took the flowers, burying her face in the blossoms, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her tears. "I want you to think about what you just heard. I want you to put yourself in that private dining room at Pegasus Taverna. If you had driven up to Saginaw, if you had sat at that kitchen table and seen the unopened birthday card with the red stamp, what would you have done? Would you have confronted her in private and tried to fix her? Or would you have built the stage, invited the audience, and let the truth burn the theater down? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know if you think the public exposure was too far, or if it was exactly the kind of justice a narcissist deserves. If you believe that the people who raise us deserve respect, and that a lie this massive requires a consequence just as large, hit the like button. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, because there are a lot more stories about the quiet, devastating power of the truth coming your way. Until next time, protect your peace, protect your family, and never apologize for walking away from someone who tries to rewrite reality.